Good morning. I'm Carrie Ledbetter. I am the mother of 9 children and a fostered mother to many more. During my parenting time, I've had many opportunities to work with specialists and educators and psychologists and other people who provide services to persons with disabilities. I am extremely interested in the TCOM tool as a better method of identifying the strengths and needs of those who are seeking services.
My name is Bethany Blank, how some of you might know me, or Bethany Ledbetter Blank, which is my full name, which Kendra just learned today, so that's kind of fun. I am a TCOM Human Services Program Specialist with the Idaho Department of Health and Welfare. I've been CANS certified since 2017, been a CANS trainer since 2020. I'm also certified to train in the CAT, and I am certified in the ANSA and the FAST as well. So I've got a lot of experience in a bunch of different TCOM tools. And one of the unique things about me is when I started as a social worker for the state of Idaho, a lot of my value came not in my professional knowledge, but in a lot of my personal knowledge. I was a treatment foster care sibling. I wasn't in treatment foster care, but I was a sibling in a home for treatment foster care. My brother had severe developmental disabilities. So I had worked a lot in the child welfare system with individuals there. I knew a lot about developmental disabilities, a lot about domestic violence services. And so things like that just really augmented my professional experience, which when I started the CANS and other TCOM tools made me really excited because I understood how valuable they were. I will admit, it wasn't right off the bat. I think everyone's got that little bit of learning space, but for the most part.
We're going to use JD as our example today as we explore the reason that TCOM is such a valuable tool. We'll talk about the functional tool that was originally used to assess JD, and then talk about why TCOM is a better tool from a parent perspective. I'm the parent of JD, and Bethany is JD's sister and also a TCOM trainer. She'll talk about why TCOM is better from a trainer perspective, and then we'll have a time for questions and answers. We hope you have some good ones for us.
When we saw this conference title and the theme, which was standing on the shoulders of those who came before, we couldn't help but think of JD. That's where we often stand on his shoulders for what we're thinking about and how we interact with people. And we're just really happy to be able to tell you about why we need a new roof at TCOM.
Jared Donald Ledbetter Blank was adopted when he was 3 years old. When we originally adopted JD, we were given very little information about his past. He wasn't estimated at that time to live beyond 8 years old. JD passed away 2 years ago, just shy of being 30. So he had a long and happy life with our family. JD had communication issues. He couldn't eat independently. He couldn't dress himself, and many other things that were wrong about him. And we're going to bring up some of those, but also some of the positive things that being related to JD included. He had cerebral palsy. He had Noonan syndrome, seizure disorder, unshunted hydrocephalus, fibromatosis. He was nonverbal and incontinent, and he had obsessive compulsive disorder, which was very difficult to deal with. We learned much about JD during the first 5 years after adoption. Each diagnosis that he had framed different needs and limitations that directed both his care and the progress of his life. In addition to his physical limitations and mental limitations, we also learned that JD gave the best hugs on earth, that he was known in the community with Chewy Barca, who's sitting on his lap. He was welcomed everywhere that he went. And so many people knew him that we didn't know, that it was really interesting to go out in community with him. Had a wicked sense of humor. He particularly enjoyed giving Bethany a hard time. He was polite and caring. He would try with the one arm that he could use to put on my jacket when we were sitting. I had a wide circle of friends who called themselves JD's guides. And he was an advocate for the disabled. We spoke frequently with JD in the community to help people who didn't deal with disabled children on a daily basis to understand the kind of life that he lived and the kind of supports that he needed.
One thing you'll see for that is you'll notice in this picture, Chewy Barca is very small. She's not the kind of service animal you would typically associate with a kid with JD's level of need. But part of her service was to get kids interested and adults interested in coming up to talk to him about his dog. And that was part of the service she provided, was for that communication piece. And so she's actually in the back room. If you hear any yips, that's her telling us that she's still here.
She wants out.
So we're going to talk a little bit about what functional assessment tool was used for JD when we first got him. And the state of Idaho, because JD was on Medicare and Medicaid as an adopted child, we adopted him from Pennsylvania and they reimbursed the state of Idaho. That's how it works down here. But to do that, they had to assess him every year on something called the SIBR, the Scales of Independent Behavior Revised. I apologize that some of these pictures are a little bit washed out. I looked for a clearer book and I couldn't find it. And that's not the only way it isn't clear. If you take a look at that picture, that subscale list is insane. I first looked at that and I went, wow. Apparently we're going to be doing some sort of magic charm or witchcraft before we decide what functional level this kid is at. So the SIBR is 26 pages long, and it would take hours to complete, not just for the individual who was rating or assessing JD, but also for the families. You would show up to the appointment, and the interviewer was required to ask specific questions in a set order in a very specific way. And if you caught the gist of what was going on and tried to answer before, they would stop you and force you to go back and re-listen to the front. And so it was a very frustrating and annoying process.
And it was one that was repetitive. So they did it over and over again, often on an annual basis. And JD's level of disability was such that the scoring really never changed. It was always the same.
I remember we go on that appointment, they'd be like, any changes? And we'd be like, nope, no miracles this year. So that's just how it was. When we're looking at the SIBR as the functional tool used to assess JD, it's not that different from TCOM in the initial setup. It evaluated developmental functioning across 14 domains. And this was all to determine a developmental age category. So you can see there it has the subscales for gross motor skills, fine motor skills, social interaction, language comprehension, eating and meal preparation, toileting, dressing, personal self-care, domestic skills, time and punctuality, money and value, work skills, and home and community orientation. So through these subscales, they say that is all they need to determine where your developmental level is, whether you're in a preschool kindergarten level, elementary school, middle school, or high school to adult. And that, when we talk about what age someone is developmentally, I'm thinking of the Ming vignette, if anybody has seen that or remembers that, where they say that she's 14 in her physical age, but her developmental age is 7. The SIBR is the tool they use to determine that her developmental age was 7 years old. And the way that it works is a really interesting tool because it's fascinating. They are so standardized in how it's done, and it's just really it's really hard. But despite that, it functions a lot like an IQ test. I watched them giving IQ tests in Oregon while I worked in one of the school districts, and that's what it reminds me of. The other thing that makes me chuckle a little bit is it also is on a 0, 1, 2, 3 scale, but this one is more of the Likert scale, which we know the TCOM tools are not. So when you're working on the SIBR questions, you can see that it goes from never or rarely, even if asked, does well but not well, or about 1/4 of the time may need to be asked, to does fairly well about 3/4 of the time, and a 3 is does very well almost or always without being asked.
And I wanted to mention that you'll notice that the SIBAR scales go from pre-K to high school age, adult age. JD never scored that high. He was always lower than that when you did the SIBAR.
Yeah. And so how this is like an IQ test is what happens is you'll ask questions until you can't answer. You've gotten 3 that you couldn't answer above a 0 in a row. And that's a lot like IQ tests where they'll ask a question until you miss one. And then once you miss 3 in a row, it's like, cool, next section. That's how we go there. And this section right here, I believe this was the subscale for, oh my gosh, now I got to look back at my notes over here. This was in the subscale for fine motor skills and social interactions. So the first one turns heads towards speaker when name is called. And when we would go through those question center sessions, I remember quite often we would be like, well, he does. You just have to wait 3 minutes because it has to go in. He has to process it. And then he has to, put the input to his body that he needs to make a turn, and then he'll work on it. So people would expect responses from him to be instantaneous. And you had to give him a minute to process or 2 minutes to process, depending on how he was doing that day. And so we would say that, and it would muddy things up even further because they'd be like, wait, well, does that count or not? And then watches for at least 3 minutes at a time, a television program or people in the room who are talking, points to familiar books and pictures in a book on request. JD had no fine motor skills. He was very much rake and grasp. He wasn't able to get past that because of the cerebral palsy. So when you'd ask that, it would be kind of cruel because you'd be like, well, yeah, he could tell you which side of the book the thing is. If I asked him, is it on this side or this side? He could tell you which side. But he couldn't point to a picture book. He just didn't have those fine motor skills to be able to hold his hands there for long enough. And so a lot of the pieces of the SIBAR were kind of cruel because it couldn't really evaluate what was going on with somebody who was as complex as JD was. It didn't have the dexterity itself in it,
right,
to be able to understand those different nuances in the tool.
And you might also notice that it's kind of a negative scale. You either can do it or you can't. And so as you progress through the testing, the more often you can't do something, a child can't do something, the more negative the evaluation becomes.
Mm-hmm. So we went through that entire process each year. It was another torture session. In the beginning, it was mainly mom doing them alone. I became JD's co-guardian when he was 17. I was 18, which would have made me 23. So when I was 23, I became his co-guardian, and I started going to those sessions as well. And you'll find that, honestly, the SIBAR didn't really tell us that much. It told us that JD had a functional level of a newborn. It didn't tell us that he understood far more than he could verbally communicate, what we could leverage in his care, what we had access to for his care. It didn't tell us about his wicked sense of humor, that he loved movies and TV shows. To kind of illustrate that, he is hugging a Star Wars blanket that he got as a present just because. So he loved Star Wars. He used to go to the movies all the time with the family. And so this was him being so excited about his new Star Wars blanket that he had just received. So he really genuinely loved movies and TV shows. He had favorites. Holes. He loved Holes. And I believe Psych and Monk were also among 2 of his favorites. Oh, and he was a total nerd because he had also seen every single Star Trek and Stargate episode. So this kid was a total nerd, and it didn't tell us that either. He had a dedicated and knowledgeable family, highly knowledgeable, kind of unheard of in the DD field, with how much we had to do for support. He was surrounded by a supportive community, as Dr. Ledbetter said. People would come up to us that we had never seen before and come talk to him. We'd hear things often like, oh, yeah, my son was in his class, and that's how we got to know him. Or kids would just come up and be like, JD, man, you excited for the lesson tomorrow? And so he really did have a supportive community that even we were not aware of.
Interestingly enough, with the functional level of a newborn, when he was in high school, he actually participated in the school newsletter by evaluating movies. for the school. He could do thumbs up and thumbs down. And so he would tell the students with a picture of himself in the school newsletter whether the movie that they were evaluating that week was good or not by doing thumbs up or thumbs down.
Mm-hmm. And the last thing the SIBR didn't tell us is that JD was actually involved in his own care. He was very, very clear if he wanted to do something or didn't want to do something, and he had providers that he worked very well with. For example, for his, oh my gosh, I'm going to totally, it was his orthopedic surgeon.
Mm-hmm.
He had to do a lot of physical therapy, and then when he would go to these checkups, he had to do a lot of physical exercises, which were really hard and time consuming. And you could tell if JD liked a provider or not by how hard he tried, even when he hated it. So Dr. Gooch, who we call the Gooch, he would really be involved and tell her how he felt and stuff because she would listen to him. And that was all stuff that the SIBR couldn't tell us, is that he was and able to be and was involved in his own care.
I'm going to talk a little bit about the negative parent perspective of the SIBR testing and how we approach working with children with disabilities. JD wanted a home. He always wanted to be at home. He wanted to be with his siblings. He wanted to be with his family. Home was the first word that he ever said. He said home before he could say mom. What he hated most in life was having rain on his head. Rain was ew. If he even thought it was going to rain, he began to get agitated. If it thundered, he would become frantic. He didn't want rain on his head. In fact, if anybody even said rain, it began to make him nervous. And he would begin to chant, ew, 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 and then want to come inside the house. The only thing that would calm JD down when those events occurred was to remind him that mom put a new roof on the house to keep you safe. And we needed to build a home for him that kept his head dry. And we'll use this analogy throughout our presentation as a reference point, that we're trying to build something that meets the needs of a specific individual by how we evaluate them and how we set up the process for providing them services. When we're building alone as a parent, we have to know everything about everything. We have to know about cerebral palsy. We have to know about Noonan syndrome. We have to know about how to incorporate his life into the community, how to communicate with him, how to get him toileted, how to bathe him. All of these things fall solely on the caregiver's shoulders. And this can be a daunting job. It's like trying to build a house by yourself without a hammer. And so we appreciate having help when things are happening like this. Some of the problems and challenges related to building alone are really easily understood things like physical limitations, the weight of care. Prior to JD's passing, he weighed 130 pounds. Lifting, particularly as an older adult, lifting 130 pounds redundantly during the day over and over and over again is physically limiting. And that physical limitation also limits the amount of time that a person can spend in community. If you can't get them in and out of the car, that's a limitation that occurs because you're physically not capable enough as a caregiver to meet that need. As an individual caregiver, there are often times that you have safety risks, particularly those related to backup and emergencies. I'm fortunate enough to have 8 other children who were able to help on occasion, particularly Bethany. But many people don't have those kind of backups. And lots of people in the community are afraid to work with the disabled because they don't know what to do. There's an endless to-do list when you're dealing with a disabled person. You have to manage their medications, you have to manage their appointments, you have to get them to and from their day environment, you have to take care of transportation. And there's very little time for self-care for caregivers. As a result of these issues, caregivers burn out and they begin to let things slip, not because they want to or their intent is to provide less care, but just because the daily grind becomes too much. We're often isolated because with a child like JD with 24/7 needs, you're frequently not able to get out yourself into community. You're not able to participate in events that are appropriate for the caregiver's age because you're dedicated to the child or the person's age. And as a result, you face isolation and fatigue. The solution to this is to have more builders, and this is where TCOM comes in. Um, Transformational collaborative outcome management provides so much more for the parent than things like the SIBR did. SIBR told us the negative aspects of JD. TCOM works to develop a shared vision for JD that is transformational, that helps to make the best of his life and subsequently our lives. Transformational collaborative outcome management is, first of all, collaborative. You have a shared vision. If you just share a vision, it means that you have more than one person involved in developing a vision. And that having people involved who are outside the family relieves so many of the stressors that occur from being a full-time caregiver. The framework of TCOM represents management. As the information is gathered about this person who needs to have support services, everything begins to pull together and have stability. That framework gives not only the individual, but also the family, the supports that it needs to be truly effective. The floors of the building represent outcomes. Each layer of the supports are built upon the layer that preceded it and how the space is used and impacting the individual, it becomes a more solid structure. And finally, the roof symbolizes the transformation that's possible. For JD, the roof was all the things that kept the rain off his head and kept him from having ooh in his life. Together, the structure provides a framework where each part of the structure supports the other. And the integrity of the structure requires balance and coordination between each piece. From a parent's perspective, TCOM helps to organize information about the child's strengths, needs, risks, and resources in a structured way. Provides information that allows you to make informed decisions. It puts the parent or the caregiver's input as the central focus of the process. So the focus becomes, what can we do based on the perspectives that the parent has provided, their observations, their priorities, the things that they care about for the individual's life. And it recognizes that every child is unique, that there aren't a whole lot of JDs out in the world. He was unique and he had unique needs, and he also had unique characteristics and strengths. TCOM focuses on strengths and progress. So unlike other evaluation tools, which are evaluating what you are, and it just tells what you are at a given point in time, TCOM helps to move beyond that and look at what can happen in the individual's life that's positive, and what supports are needed to make those positive results occur. The assessments in the care planning are made visible and structured. And as a parent, this is extremely helpful because you know not only what the limitations are, but you know how that assessment can be used in a positive way to influence the life of the person you're caring for. The likelihood of meaningful and sustainable improvements is much more likely when you build from a foundation such as that created by TCOM. Just briefly, to compare the CBAR and TCOM, TCOM is care planning and collaboration. CBAR is a standardized measurement of adaptive and maladaptive behavior. In TCOM, the parent's role is central to the development of the assessment. In the CBAR, the parent's role is to just respond to structured questions and to not provide additional information. It's a yes, no, they can or they can't do whatever. The focus of TCOM is on the individual's strengths, their needs, the risks that impact them, and the outcomes that you hope to provide support for. While the CBAR provides an assessment of functional independence and problem behaviors. So JD bit himself, which is fairly common, I understand, for children with cerebral palsy. It's a way that they express their frustration. What the CBAR doesn't tell you is how you're going to deal with that in daily life.
Or how his caregivers are dealing with it.
Right. Which has all sorts of implications: emotional, physical, psychological, legal. What can you do to prevent the child from biting himself? If you tie his hands down, is that legal or not legal? Lots of things have more requirements for providing an overall perspective than providing a perspective on what they can or can't do. The strengths of the TCOM are flexible, collaborative, strengths-based, and cross-system identification of what the child needs and what the family needs to support the child. While the CBAR is a standardized norm comparison, and it's policy relevant, it provides a support for having insurance and programs and services provided, but it really doesn't look at what the strengths are of the person being evaluated. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, what can be leveraged for them?
What can be leveraged to make life better, not only for them, but also for the family. TCOM is the best tool from my perspective for families who are seeking coordinated, personalized care. And it validates not only the needs of the individual, but also the needs and expectations of the family. It is best when families are highly involved in the care of the individual that's being evaluated, and where they have an active interest in being participants in the process. Now, from JD's perspective, what he wanted often couldn't be evaluated on a test like the CBAR. What he wanted was not to have rain on his head. What he wanted was to be with his friends, with his family, to have his dog in his lap, to go for rides in the van, to watch Full House on the television, and to go to the movies. That's what JD wanted. From his perspective, none of those things were evaluated on the CBAR. They didn't have meaning in terms of that particular assessment tool. In terms of TCOM, JD's perspective had more value and more impact on what was done to help him in his life.
How did I forget about Full House? I did a whole talk on TV he loved, and I forgot Full House.
You forgot Full House.
He was an Uncle Jesse man, if anybody understands Full House. So we talked a little bit about the parent perspective. Now I'm going to talk from a trainer perspective. As I've gone on my TCOM journey, I have had more and more appreciation with each new thing I learn about how effective a TCOM tool can be in helping us work with individuals with complex needs from a developmental disability standpoint, a behavioral health standpoint, all of that. JD's physical limitations are apparent. You can't look at any of these pictures. I mean, here he is, he's in physical therapy, he's holding himself up. He's giving himself a thumbs up because he has been holding himself up for a minute. And JD had very little trunk support, so that was hard for him. And he was showing us how effortless it was that day with that thumbs up. His physical limitations are very apparent. You looked at him and you kind of understood, like, okay, this is a kid that can't do a lot. And the SIBR could confirm those physical limitations and the severe risk factors that JD was dealing with, but it didn't give us a holistic view of JD. You can see JD is here in the museum with Mom. He's at the Museum of the Ancients in Thanksgiving Point in Utah. And a more human tool like the ANSA, that gives us that more holistic view of JD and his family. So I worked with Dr. Ledbetter, or Mom for me, to fill out an ANSA for JD, which was really interesting because I was looking at it from both points. Is that something I know as a TCOM trainer and a TCOM rater, or is that something I know as his care provider? And don't worry, I did go over this with my training partner, so he took out the bias I would have from being able to do that. And we went through this and we rated JD on the standard comprehensive ANSA 3.0. And we wanted to share with you some of these results. The first being that JD had considerable strengths. You can see, you might look at a kid like JD and be like, wow, I'm not sure what strengths you could even bring to bear. But he had a ton of them. He had great family strengths. There was great love and communication. There were inside jokes. JD could yell for us and we knew we were talking about. I once told a boy I was dating that JD was my best friend. And he's like, well, how is that possible? You can't talk to him or anything. And I'm like, I can talk to him. I have full conversations with him. He just had to speak his language. So he had considerable family strengths. He had talents and interests. We already talked about movies and TV and how that helped him interact with the community. He had spiritual and religious strengths. JD identified as Christian. He enjoyed going to church. He had hymns he liked and hymns he didn't like. And I literally wear a tank top with all of my outfits because JD had beliefs that you shouldn't have your back show. So when I would go to adjust something on his wheelchair, if my shirt rode up, he would yank it down. So now I wear a tank top. So he had considerable spiritual and religious beliefs that we knew about and that he could communicate. He also had educational vocational strengths. He went to school until he was 21, which is a standard for individuals with severe developmental disabilities, is that they can apply for an extension to go till they're 21. And then he actually went into an adult day program that provided occupational therapy and work skills. And so through that, he was getting educational vocational strengths. And so it's kind of interesting how they would figure out how things would work for him and to help him figure out how to go through life. And this is all stuff that the SIBR never even considered. They never considered what's positive going on. What are things that he can do in this way? And instead it was like, wow, what are things he can do? Oh, he can't do that. He can't do that. And so it was really a negative tool rather than this positive of here are his strengths. JD required a lot of coordination. He had multiple doctors, therapists that included a physician, neurologist, an optometrist, a dentist specializing in work with the disabled, a gastroenterologist, a wound care specialist, a medication manager, home care nurses, 3 orthopedic doctors, a variety of surgeons, and a service coordinator. And all these people were in his life weekly, if not and monthly. We saw them all each month. There were a lot of cooks in our kitchen, might be the best way to put it. And as we know, if anybody who's read any of Dr. Lyons's books, that the great thing about the TCOM tools is they allow a way for us to see that information and to share it with each other amongst providers. JD didn't get to have an ANSA. He died before it actually became an option here in the state of Idaho. That became an option in 2024, and he died the year previously. And it makes me sad because each of those individuals that I mentioned before had to be briefed on everything about JD by the family. We had to go through it. Anytime you met a new doctor or one doctor stopped practice and transferred to another, we had to go through the whole story again, which was inevitably an hour and a half long. It was almost like therapy where you kind of told them about things. And having a tool that could help them get to an overall picture would have cut down that on-ramp to more specific questions needed for the specialities a lot faster. JD had a lot of medical trauma for various reasons. At one point, I believe he lived in a hospital. I think it was 6 months at one time. And anytime we had to spend extended amounts of times in the doctor's office, it would just re-up that medical trauma issue. So the TCOM tools are better for that. They would have helped get an on-ramp for his next providers a lot better. You can see in life functioning, JD, his older sister, painted this portrait for him. It is a picture of him in space doing a spaceship. I already told you he was a huge geek and nerd, had seen every Star Trek, so he's got the Star Trek emblem on his shirt right there. His lamp also had rockets and clouds on it, and he had glow-in-the-dark stars all over his room. So I thought that was a great picture to kind of show the life functioning domain for JD. You can see for JD, he interacted with his family really well. He didn't have any needs in employment purely because he couldn't work a job. Sometimes they offered that as part of his goals, and we usually would just laugh because we'd be like, okay, who's going to do that all day? But he did have needs in medical, physical. He had severe needs in developmental, intellectual, of course, because he had severe developmental disabilities. He couldn't do any of his independent living skills, so those are rated as a 3 as well. As are his basic activities of daily living. He needed a completely specialized vehicle for transportation, and he would need that every day to get to all of his appointments and any services he needed. And then decision making. JD, while being very smart and having all of these positives, he still had some impaired decision making, which we think kind of went back to the obsessive compulsive disorder, because he wanted long sleeve shirts on in 110-degree weather, so he could make decisions about that. And sometimes he didn't want to take his meds during the day, and his meds were vital for his functioning. So that is another reason we put decision making is so high, is because he would often make decisions that were really not conducive to his safety or security.
To life.
But in the SIBR, if we had looked at their life functioning domain, as you saw, they had about 3 subscales that related to this. He would have been zeros across the board. He couldn't have done any of it. And here in the TCOM tool for the ANSA, we get a much more nuanced picture where we see like, oh, okay, so he is actually interacting well with his family. There's not a lot of conflict there. And that he doesn't really have needs in residential stability or in issues with recreational use. But we do see where he does have those severe needs, where he really would be kind of a 0 on their scale, would be a 3 in ours. In behavioral emotional trauma, this I think is interesting because, again, on all the subscales, we would have just been straight zeros. I don't think they even really thought about this in the SIBR. But JD had issues in adjustment to trauma, and a lot of that came in through that medical trauma. A lot of his responses had to do with avoiding those issues with medical trauma. And then anger control. JD was kind of once the switch was flipped, he couldn't really stop seeing red. You kind of had to isolate to get him to kind of de-stimulate back down to average functioning. And so that also went along with his impulse control. For his impulse control, though, I almost wonder if a little bit was because he had no physical ability to maintain. And so some things just came out thinking they were impulsive, and he couldn't explain it. But that was the best information we had at the time to rate the impulse control. So as you can see, we get a very nuanced view of JD's behavioral emotional needs and also the traumas he's experienced and his reactions to those. You'd probably be thinking like, wow, so he was that severely disabled. How could you even tell what like those traumatic stress symptoms were? And it was like, well, we could tell because of how he talked. The avoidance and hypervigilance. Mom described how he would start as soon as he heard anything related to rain. No, ew, no, keep it off my head, keep it off my head. So he was very much trying to avoid those situations, and he was very vigilant in being aware of when they would happen.
Also point out that JD was in multiple foster homes before he was adopted. So he had extreme caregiving and attachment losses in his history. And sadly, caregivers for persons with disabilities frequently change, other than family caregivers. So people that would provide services to him often changed every 6 months, every year. And each time that would happen, it would disrupt his ability to cope with his life.
Which is another reason adjustment to trauma was rated so high. And because of the TCOM tool and how the ANSA is set up, we can actually give evidence for that and show it in a very non-vague way, which is kind of amazing. For his risks, he did have risks. The biggest one being, of course, his non-suicidal self-interest behavior, his biting. JD had MRSA several times because of the biting. As we know, a bite from a human will always become infected. And we did, because it was a 3, we did have interventions in place for that. JD was always in restraints. He could not lift his hand to his mouth. Now, that doesn't mean that we had his arms tied down. We had it pretty well figured out where he could sit in his chair and where it supported him and the level. And then we had been trained by a doctor, and we carried a note with us at all times from a psychologist. Mm-hmm. And because of how often JD was getting checked out by medical professionals, there was that level of oversight to see if there were ever any issues. He never had any bruises around his wrists or anything like that. And in fact, they were all amazed because JD very rarely had any medical sores or anything like that from being in a wheelchair or in a bed all day. We were very good about keeping sure that up on skin conditions and stuff. So his biggest issue really was that non-suicidal self-interest behavior. And then, of course, his danger to others, because if he couldn't get to himself, he would try to get for you. He'd go for you. So, and that's why his frustration management is so high, and his hostility. And he was very aware, because if he couldn't get to him, he would start going. It was almost like that alien vision where it was just your mouth would open and close.
And surprisingly, many of his aides in the school environment would complain about this, and they had to be reminded, he's in a wheelchair, he can't chase you. Just move away.
Just lock the wheelchair, step back, you'll be fine. So the great thing is he does have, with his limited self-control and how it would kind of take over, we can still communicate that in the ANSA. We don't need to worry about losing those risks, that they're able to be there. And then, of course, the last piece, which is the caregiver ingredient. And this, in my opinion, is why the TCOM tools are so valuable, and especially for individuals with high needs and high developmental needs, is because from a trainer and provider perspective, the caregivers are everything. If they go down, we know the kids are going to go down, and we need to be able to track that. We need to know what strengths they have, where the caregivers need support to shore up, because with those kids, if the caregiver goes down, the next step usually is institutionalization, lifetime institutionalization. We're talking group homes, or with JD, the level of care would have actually had to have been a residential hospital. They stated they wouldn't have been able to keep him in a group home. So what we can see from this caregiver layout is JD's caregivers were rock stars. Thank you. We voted it, we rated it, but we're managing a considerable amount of stress and physical issues. A lot of them from lifting repeatedly 160 pounds. There's also a lot of issues in behavioral health. There's a lot of, which just happens when you're worried about so many things so often. And also social resources, like Dr. Ledbetter already said, it is very isolating. But we're able to see that. We're able to see where we need to shore that up and where they can kind of leverage and help us. I know as a provider, the first few things I want to know is, okay, is the family going to be involved, and do they have knowledge about what's going on? And with the TCOM tools, I can look right off the bat, okay, this family's involved, they have that knowledge, and we can leverage that and use it. So when we talk about needing a new roof, JD needed a new roof. he would worried about it constantly. And like we said, the only thing that would ease his fears was being reminded that, hey, mom built a new roof, so it can't rain on your head. And it almost became a mantra. It's okay, we have a new roof. Rain can't get in. And he'd be like, and you would even ask him to repeat it back to you. Can rain get in? And he'd be like, no. And I'm like, so are we safe? And he'd be like, yeah. And so the functional assessments like the SIBR, they're valuable because they can determine the developmental age. That's something we need to know, but they can't give us that holistic picture. We need the new roof of the TCOM tools to give us a holistic view that includes their strengths and the support they get from their caregivers. And we can let families of those with disabilities know that we have this new functional tool that'll evaluate more than just their loved one's deficits. It'll highlight their strengths and protect them from disappearing as a person in their functional assessment. That SIBR didn't see JD at all. And hopefully you've been able to see by the pictures we put in that JD was a complex and hilarious and fun little dude. Here he is. This was my dog, Rowdy, who was a 100-pound Airedale lab. And JD had a sled. So we would attach Rowdy to it like a sled dog so he could go down hills and stuff. He would steal our candy. That's him stealing my peach gummy ring and eating it in front of me. Like mom said, as a little brother, I was often a target for his jokes. And then he liked cosplay. He was a total nerd. That's him in a Superman outfit. And with tools like the ANSA and the cans and the FAST and the CAT, we're able to see this person and not just what can't they do. And we get to see who they are. At this time, we are going to open it up to questions. And I believe really quickly, I'm going to show you our thank you slide so I can just go back and so we'll be able to see Kendra while answering these. So we want to say thank you. There's our information. We did upload the slides for you guys, and I'm going to exit out of this so we can answer the questions that Kendra has gathered.
All right. Thank you so much for a phenomenal presentation. We do not have any questions in the chat at this time, but we are open. If you have any questions, comments, please feel free to enter those inside of the chat. We are receiving some comments. Dr. Lyons really does appreciate and now understands why you're such an amazing trainer, Bethany. A lot of individuals are very thankful for you sharing your story.
Can you hear me, Kendra?
We can.
Oh, good. So I started to write something in the chat, but it's a little bit too complicated. So I just thought maybe I could jump in and share my question, because I was struck by the way, both of you, thank you very much, and thank JD. I mean, what an amazing young man, an amazing story, and so forth. But I was struck by a couple of things that seemed to be an emerging theme that seemed a little bit congruent with your story too, is the role of helping others and helping yourself. And I'm just curious, because you dedicated this talk and you focused it about JD, and I'm quite sure you were significant in his lives. But I was struck by how significant he was in your lives. And so I just was curious about that in your journey to be helping others, and how that your experiences with JD influenced, for instance, your career choices, Bethany, and so forth. So
as JD's mother, I think, Dr. Lyons, it's interesting that I have attention deficit disorder. I'm hyperactive. You know, I'm go all the time, involved in a lot of things. Having JD in my life slowed me down, and that ability to slow down made a tremendous difference in not only what I do for a living, but my ability to focus on specific problems and seek resolution to them. So he was my teacher in that regard.
yeah, that's
I would echo that. And I would also say that for my professional life, Much to the dismay of the Developmental Disabilities Agency within the Department of Health and Welfare, I did choose to go to behavioral health instead, just so I did have a little bit of a disconnect. Because, you know, when you're dealing with it at home all the time, doing it for work can also be really burnout inducing. But there are kids who have cross-cutting needs, where they have severe developmental disability issues and they have behavioral health needs. And I find that my experience means that I am a great resource for the individuals that I work with. And also, I got a lot of kids directed to me that had more severe needs. I became really well known for being able to work with those kids who had communication issues. Either they were nonverbal or they communicated in very different ways. And that's because I already had the patience built up and the ability to understand some of those less well-known kind of nonverbal cues.
It's also interesting to note that as one of 9 children, JD's 8 brothers and sisters, the majority of them are involved in service professions. We have teachers that work with children who have language deficits and disabilities. We have nurses, we have social workers. You know, having him in their lives opened up a perspective for them that they would not otherwise have had.
That makes sense. Thank you. There's a couple of questions, Kendra, embedded in a large series of thank yous.
Yes, so we do have a question for you, Dr. Ledbetter. What was that adjustment like for you with the adjusting your mental health condition and caring for JD?
I've trained as a K-12 educator, as a teacher, and have worked my whole life with foster children and with children with needs. Adopting a child with special needs is far different than having a theoretical or a non-emotional perspective on that. When we adopted JD, we knew that he had cerebral palsy. We knew that he had a limited life expectancy. Through the course of his life, all of these other diagnoses emerged. And with each one of those, we had to learn new tools, new techniques, new providers, new ways to modify our family environment. So it was a continual learning process for that. For me, it meant pulling back. I was a government consultant at the time that we adopted JD. And I became a stay-at-home mom working at a distance. So I work for a distance education institution right now so that I could manage his care. But it also meant that women of my age in particular, I'm in my 70s, that they're out doing the retirement thing, and I was not. So social interactions were extremely limited. So there was an adjustment with JD. He was totally worth it, absolutely worth it. An amazing young man and someone that we miss greatly.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much for sharing. I do have a few more questions. I know that the Anza, Kansas is very collaborative and that JD was not able to participate in the assessment, but I'm curious, in what ways would you have involved JD to participate in the Anza in scoring?
So JD could have interacted. You just had to phrase things in yes, no questions, or you could have given him options on one hand or another hand, and he could have pointed. And so it did take a little bit more. It's almost more like playing 20 questions for things like that. And I know the TCOM tools are not a question thing, but for some of those kids, when you're adapting, how you can communicate with them, they do become a little bit. And so JD would have told us things like, hey, do you feel like you get along really well with the family, or do you sometimes have problems? And he would have pointed to whichever hand he felt represented better.
Or he would tease you by pointing to the wrong question and then laughing.
Yeah, he would have giggled hilariously. And then you'd be like, really? And he'd be like, no.
Oh, that's awesome. Another question that we have in the chat. They are very grateful for your presentation, but they do Do you find other functional assessments also fall short from complex cases? And how can we convince other providers to adopt TCOM?
I I do find other assessments to be very limiting. And I think one thing that needs to be done from my perspective as a parent is that parents need to be um, given the opportunity to understand what TCOM is and what its benefits are. So,
Yeah.
moving that knowledge base back to include the family before you do the assessment is also important. Many parents are exhausted, they're frustrated, they have limited services for the child that they're parenting. Um, they're isolated, in a lot of ways, socially and emotionally with care. And so they may not be forward seeking when it comes to finding out about new tools. And so it's incumbent on the TCOM teams to actually figure out ways that you can make this tool visible so that they know that they have an option, which they don't right now.
Mm-hmm.
That's awesome. All right, we have another question. For this kind of case with extremely challenging care, how does one handle Principle 3? And so for some jurisdictions, it is Principle 3. For others, it may not be Principle 3. So it is the rating the youth, right? The not the youth in service principle. All right. I imagine a lot of care could overlap with interventions or mask needs. Some of the ratings, like school, I was surprised to see ratings as no need, but I'm also an analyst and not involved in case work directly, so my opinions may be very flawed.
Well, I'll take this. I feel like that's firmly in trainer territory.
Yeah.
So JD, we tried to rate him. We did it before he got to his illness that eventually ended up taking his life. So we decided, we picked the point in time we rated him at. At that point in time, he was 27.
Mhm.
So he was 27 years old in our head at that point in time that we rated him on. And he wasn't in school. So school wouldn't be a need because he wasn't in school. So we couldn't rate that as a need. There were also a few where I very much had to go through those questions, which is why I had my training partner, Brad Lamson. Some of you might know him. He and I went through it together to make sure to kind of mesh and check for that bias that we would have, like I said. And so that's how we went by it. Like, okay, is this an area that where there actually is a need and we have an intervention in place? And we were in the unique position where we knew all of the professional and all of the unprofessional interventions we had in place. So it made it a little bit easier for us to rate that. So we did take it into account. And that's why it took me about a week to rate this CANS, and I would rate a domain and then I'd have to go through 3 other people to make sure it worked out.
Yeah. Angie, I think we have time for a combined question. So we have 2 questions left. I think I can combine them into one question for you. So if JD was here, right, what would you think he would say? Or do you think he would say if he were here to hear your wonderful talk today? And another piece is, what are some key takeaways that you would like from the audience to leave with or maybe act upon?
The primary thing that I would want you to take away is that every person you evaluate is an individual. They have things that they can do as well as things that they can't do. They have people that love them and care about, what's happening in their lives. And looking at them as individuals rather than disabilities is really important. When I refer to JD, it's my son JD. It's not my son JD with and all the list of his disabilities. As a parent, that's what I would want you to know.
I refer to him as that punk, but like we know, I was usually the brunt of his jokes.
That steals your king.
Exactly, younger siblings. So I think JD would have been happy to hear this talk today. He would have been embarrassed. He would have been hiding his head the whole time, but laughing secretly as we're talking about him. He liked people learning stuff. he would go to the medical college. We would go and train the nurses on how to do bolus feeding tubes because he had a permanent tube. And he always thought that was awesome, was being able to teach people how to work with kids like him and being the center of attention. But he would have pretended to be embarrassed and hid his head the whole time. And I think the big thing I want you to take away is the same. Like the TCOM tools, I hear a lot of criticism sometimes about how limiting they are. And I actually think they open up a whole world because, as you know, the items are only limited by what a jurisdiction puts in them. And it does gives us a chance to look at that person as an individual, and also to make sure that you don't forget that there is a person behind all those numbers and that what we're seeing is a whole story.
Thank you so much. We appreciate you spending your time with us today. Thank you for this amazing presentation. Thank you for everyone who joined us today, as y'all will be joining your next group in a few minutes. So thank you, and we'll see you in the next room.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Kendra.
Thank you all.
Bye, everybody.